and welcome to the TC Dojo from Single Sourcing Solutions. The TC Dojo is a TechCom community that's driven by you. Tell us what you want to learn, you choose the topics, and we find the experts. In the dojo this morning, we are extremely lucky to have Keith Schengili-Roberts. Keith is a longtime expert practitioner of information architecture, which is why we tapped him for this session. He's a researcher and an information gatherer, which explains how he's so good at IA. He likes to find out things and see how they connect together. He can work at the top level or at the bottom one, and we're grateful he can talk about one of our most requested topic. He lectures at UT, that's University of Toronto, not Texas, and works for the DITA OASIS committees. He's a great sport. He testified as a former book brain in my session at LavaCon last year, and I had so much fun with that. He's fabulous, and we're grateful he's agreed to be our TC Dojo master today. Keith wants you to save your questions until the end, so be sure to type them in when you think of them so you don't forget what you wanted to ask. Are you ready, Keith?
Oh, yeah.
Show your screen, and it's all yours.
I will show my screen. Let's see. There we go. Hopefully that's coming across.
Perfect.
Hello, everybody. This is called Are You Getting the Most Out of DITA Content Reuse? You've already heard my name. It's Keith Schengili-Roberts, and I am with IXIASOFT, the makers of a fine DITA content management system. And without further ado, let's get started. So here's what I'm going to be chatting about today. After the sort of introductory stuff, which I won't dwell on, I'll then get into essentially two major sections for today's quick talk. One is, looking at the actual mechanics of DITA content reuse. So just, I'm hoping most people here will be familiar with how DITA content reuse is actually done. But I always find it a good idea to sort of throw this sort of stuff in as a refresher. It's like, you may not have, it's like, oh yeah, I haven't thought of it that way. So that's why I've got this here. And look at the basic, as I say here, look at the tools within DITA itself for creating reusable content. And then after that, looking how to actually make it work, because there's the mechanics and then there's the human aspect. Because the tools are great, but it's people who have to work with them. So then I'll be looking at what you can do to make all of this actually work together for you. And then after that, of course, a question and answer session. So as Liz already talked about, who's this guy? Well, that's me, Keith Schengili-Roberts, and I am a DITA evangelist. I'm a liaison with OASIS that just recently came up with the DITA 1.3 specification, which I'm hoping that people in this audience are aware of and maybe looking at already. I also have a terrific benefit, now that I'm with IXIASOFT, to do actual research on how people are using structured content like DITA, and bringing that back to not just to the company but also to OASIS and the community at large. I'm a lecturer at the lecturer in information architecture at the University of Toronto, and I've got over 10 years of experience with DITA XML. My hair in this picture is actually slightly grayer. 10 plus years of XML will do that to you. Probably familiar to at least a few people here, at least I hope, is that I'm also the fellow behind the DITA Writer website, and this is something I started just over 5 years ago. Basically to, sort of put out some of my own ideas as to what I thought about DITA in general, and opinion on things, and also just to realize at the time that there was really no one central place where you could easily find information on things like DITA conferences, books talking about DITA, companies that were using DITA, which is I think close to 600 odd companies now listed. CMSs that use DITA editor, so on and so forth. It's been a fairly popular website. My last piece on there was when I was actually the keynote speaker at DITA Fest in Japan. I got some interesting insights as to how DITA is actually being used over there. Well, and I throw in interviews with people who are influencing, making a difference in the world of DITA. So if you're not aware of it, just go check it out. It's worth a look. All right, so let's get back to the actual subject here. Let's talk about DITA reuse, the mechanics. So essentially, there are these 5 main levels of DITA reuse within DITA. And to be fair, DITA is actually was right off the top of the bat was created with the idea of reuse in mind. And I don't have the slide here, but there, in the very first publication that was created talking about DITA by Michael Priestley of IBM, in the title was the idea of here is a mechanism for using content in a reusable fashion, designing it and working with it in such a way that it is specifically so that you can leverage the most out of content that you already have. And these days there are essentially 5 main sets of mechanisms for doing this. One is sort of the topmost level, structural with say DITA map and map level, then the individual topic levels, and then within the topics things like ConRefs, and then working with conditional processing using say DITA-val, and then sort of at the lowest most level keys, and also to be able to help find all of these these things for reuse. Metadata is also one of the means for being able to track down the content that you're hoping to reuse. So I like to think of DITA content reuse as essentially being something like a matryoshka, a Russian doll, where when it's done well, you have all of these nested dolls, so to speak, where you're using keys that are contained within files which are using DITA-val, which also use ConRefs that are contained within topics, and then at the outside, within DITA maps and maps. And so a reuse map might contain a topic from another map, which in turn uses ConRef, conditional processing, and keys. And while this may seem like a great way to really complicate things, when managed effectively, everything slots together really nicely, just like a set of Russian dolls. So, the highest level of reuse is structural reuse. This involves reusing, in things like entire DITA maps and maps. So with DITA maps, this really goes hand in hand with either conditional processing and or keys, because you may have for example, a particular, particular map for a product, a DITA map for a product, and the only thing that is really required to change it from old name to brand new name is just change the key within this map that handles product name, and then et voila, you have a new output type, and essentially 100% content reuse. Woohoo! That's great. You can also do the same with maps, but in some cases I have seen. In fact, IXIASOFT's own documentation actually follows this model. In some cases, we have maps which are connected to DITA maps, but they're also their own separate publications. They can be published as separate documents. And as I say here, IXIASOFT actually uses both of these scenarios. So there's some master DITA maps that contain maps which can then also be used for generating content as a book, so to speak, or as a one type of content deliverable at say the map level, or at the sort of super map DITA map level, so to speak, having all of these things in one omnibus publication. So that's the topmost level of reuse that's feasible. Then we get individual topic reuse, and as they say here, at its easiest, it's basically taking a topic and using it elsewhere. So just drag and drop, if you have that type of functionality in your editor or CMS. Take a topic from somewhere else, and hey, it looks like this actually would fit here really nicely. Let's just throw it in there. And this can be done at the topic ref level typically, and or it can be done by doing it's really a topic ref with a ConRef. Plus a key, and I'll talk again. I'll touch upon that a little bit later. This may also involve the use of conditions and keys used within a particular map. So you may you may have a particular set of keys that are being used, and as long as you have designed things well, you can drag in topics that have been created in another publication, and so long as the keys have the same types of names, you can use those effectively in different publications. And this is a matter of trying to make sure that you know what you have called your keys and where you're placing them and so on and so forth. And I'll be talking a little bit more about that shortly. Another one of the mechanisms is ConRefs, and this involves typically taking paragraph or paragraphs, sentences, or phrases. And this is handy when you just want to reuse something smaller than a whole topic. This also requires the addition of an ID to the ConRef being targeted. So you have to make sure that you are effectively adding IDs to targeted material you want to ConRef in, so to speak. Now, there's some important considerations with this, is that you want to make sure you coordinate this sort of thing with other people's in your group who are working with the docs, and it also makes a lot of sense to use a particular standardized style or convention for naming these things, so that when you're coming up with IDs, that it actually makes sense. It's either descriptive, or there is something, like there may be a spreadsheet somewhere that's keeping track as to, what ID belongs to what type of descriptive subjects or content. And actually, on the right-hand side of this slide, you can actually see the various, ConRef-specific mechanisms. Now, having said that, you need to be careful about using ConRefs. Because one thing I certainly have seen in some cases is what I call spaghetti ConRefs, and this is done when you have nested ConRefs. So in other words, ConRefs that may in fact contain ConRefs. And this is really easy to do. It's all you have to do is for example, you have let's say a couple of paragraphs, and within one of those paragraphs you actually happen to have a ConRef. And if you're looking at this in something like, say, author mode, you may not realize that it is there, or it's easy to escape one's notice. And and I have seen this with clients where they come and ask, it's like, wait a second, this used to say this, but now it says this, and I can't figure out what's going on. And while it's not always the case, it's often the case that in fact it's a ConRef within a ConRef, and somebody has changed the content at at a lower level, and that affects everything that is multiple levels higher than that. And having said that, I can remember one painful case where there was ConRefs that were it was at least 3 levels deep, and somebody had made a change to one of the most bottommost nested things, and it was not fun trying to figure that out. So what you can actually do is quite often there is one way to help resolve this is, and certainly in IXIASOFT's case, we've actually come up with a topic specialization that's designed specifically for holding ConReffable content. Now, this is something that we provide to our particular customers, but having said that, you can essentially do the exact same thing by simply agreeing to have ConReffable content within designated topics. And the other term I've actually heard used for this are called library topics, and they're essentially specifically used for holding ConReffable content. Oops. Oh, hello. Screen just went blank. Uh-oh.
I'm seeing your desktop.
Okay. Sorry, I just got something saying my driver stopped responding and has recovered. Woohoo!
Yeah.
There we are. We're back. Have to have at least one problem in a presentation, otherwise,
How do you know it's live?
Exactly. So yeah, I think I've covered that off. And the other thing I want to mention that another problem I've seen with ConRefs is you don't want to do ConReffing down the rabbit hole. So there's reuse, and then there's ridiculous levels of reuse. You could, for example, ConRef every single letter in the alphabet in your topics, and the example I actually have on the right is the quick brown fox jumps over the lazy dog, and I've ConReffed every single letter in that, and that's what the code looks like underneath it. So, there comes a point where making the conref takes more time than simply creating and writing new content. And in general, what I've seen people do that have worked with conrefs a lot is, don't try to conref below the level of a phrase. Generally speaking, it seems to work best when it's at least at what I would call the block level, such as some sort of division or paragraph, for example. But if you need to do a phrase, if you need to do something like that, try not to make it any more discrete than that level, anything below a phrase. Then we get to the idea of Conrad Pools, and these are indirect content references defined by keys at the map level. And this is good for pulling in short-term values referenced elsewhere. In other words, it pulls in values referenced elsewhere. So this is kind of an exception to the rule. This is, it is ConReffing, and it's shorter than phrases, but it works in this particular context. And on the pro side, the change, if you want to change terms easily, you can do that by pointing to different values in the referred topic and something like, say, a library topic. And on the downside, referred topic does need to be managed over time, but as long as it's actively managed, that's not a problem. Then we get to the idea of Konrath Push, and this is designed to push content at a marked place. And this is great for when you have like a quick fix where you need to insert something within a particular context. So in the example that's here, and this is from a really nice article from Chris Everlin on Konrath Push, she has the standard. I think this is in the one of the DITA example files where you're looking at changing the oil in your car, and in one particular area, like in one particular jurisdiction, there's the idea where you want to make sure you mention something about recycling the oil because in Durham, North Carolina, there's a particular thing that applies to that area and not to other ones. So in this case, you can actually use the Konrath Push topic that points to the ID in the original topic and then includes the content that ought to be thrown in. And the resulting output is, as you see at the very bottom. So it's great for a quick fix, but on the downsides, it's arguably trickier and less straightforward than with regular keys, and without good communication can lead to some unwanted surprises for other writers. So it's one of these things where I've seen it's a good idea for something like a quick fix, but if you want to have something that's more substantial, then it makes more sense in many cases to simply conditionalize it. So if you're publishing something for an audience in a particular geographic location, then have that defined at the audience level, or whatever DITA value you're using. Then we get to, quite naturally, profiling, in other words, conditional processing, which allows conditions to be applied within topics so that elements can be included or excluded during output processing. This is basically where DITA val comes into play. Now, so on the pro side, it's great for creating content aimed at multiple audiences. On the downside, it can become unwieldy as more conditions are added. The example I show here is actually showing you how to exclude values not specified. So it excludes all values not specified in the DITA val and includes audience equals everybody and novice plus product equals product and product B. So that's actually what's going on in this. And by the way, I want to mention that this example DITA val is actually from the DITA 1.3 spec, which includes much better sample code than previous DITA specs. So if you're looking for good examples, there's lots of nice material in the most up-to-date DITA 1.3 specification. A lot of work was put in that area. Now, some recommended best practices for conditional processing. Write your conditions as you create your content and keep track of what you use. And not only that, make sure you also coordinate what you're doing with others. So don't just come up with your own idiosyncratic way of doing things. Write them down, share them with others in things like, say, an internal style guide, where then you can come up with commonly used conditions and expected values between your publications. And also, don't go overboard. If things look like they're getting too complex, they probably are. So consider writing, when that's beginning to happen, consider writing things as separate topics. So in other words, if you're looking at and audiences, and you say you have like it's half a dozen or more different audience types, and you have, several different product types, and it's like, wait a second, this is getting too hard for me to easily manage. You might want to think about, if you're looking at adding another audience type or a different type of product, and it may just be a point where it's like, wait a second, this is getting a little bit too unwieldy. Why don't we just cleave this off into its own completely separate thing? And perhaps, often a good way to do this is if you're going from, say, version 1 of a product to, say, version 2, and it's like, okay, let's start over again and carry on from there. And also, don't forget, especially when you're doing things like working with DITA-val, test the output. There's nothing worse than revealing content not intended for a particular audience or product. And then at the sort of the bottommost level, we have the key mechanism. It's an indirect addressing mechanism where key names are attached to resources, which are then referenced elsewhere. That's very flexible and highly adaptable. And best practice for keys, one of the key persons who advocates on behalf of the use of keys is Elliot Kimber, and in his opinion, you should use keys absolutely everywhere. And I really do think he's onto something. This is something that I know Elliot has only fairly, like within the past six months or so, really started to advocate. And this is like you should really stop thinking about using direct addressing for things and use indirect addressing for just about everything, including keys. And he talks about two types of keys: resource and navigation only, where resource keys link to things like URLs, images, and whatever you have in, let's say, a warehouse topic, the things that you link to, and then the navigation keys or nominal keys, which are name keys for topic links. He also recommends using keys with ConRefs, in other words, ConKeyRef. And I also said, I also promised I'd talk very briefly about reuse metrics, and arguably one of the most influential articles on this topic is Bill Hackos's Reuse of Data Topics, which is from the CIDM Best Practices publication, and there's the URL for it there. And he came up with the idea of what he calls percent repository words reused in context. And that's actually a formula where which equals words in all produced content minus the words in the repository divided by the words in the repository gives you percent repository words reused. So an actual case study here is based on IXIASOFT data documents for last year. The total number of words in our repository is just shy of 270,000. Words in all produced content. So, all the PDFs, all the HTML that we produce, it's over 623,000 words. So then you do the math, and what we get out of that is essentially 132% reused content, which is an impressive number, and you better believe it. And how is over 100% reuse value possible? And I would say actually, when you look at it, it's actually quite easy, particularly given the fact that we use DITA-val extensively. So we have a number of publications that are created based on a series of DITA-val values, as much as 21 per bookmap. So we get hella good reuse. So now we've looked at the mechanics, but now let's talk about how to actually make it work, because let's face it, it's people who are making this work. So past mechanics, effective reuse within a documentation team comes down to writing content for reuse, finding the content to reuse, and then communicating about reusable content. And by the way, these 3 points, they're not mine. They actually come from my colleague Lee White's, and she had a great piece on the subject called "The Elusive Promise of Reuse." And by the way, I have a bunch of references at the very end of this presentation, things you can check out later, and that's one of them. So you want to move, in many cases, you're moving from legacy content, and few who move to DITA have the luxury of starting fresh. Legacy content needs to be converted. So, what to do is do an audit of the existing material and look for what's common, and then only port the content that we'll use in the future. So what you see here in this slide is a spreadsheet of working on a client that I did several years ago, where I did a content audit looking at the similarities and differences for 5 different examples from a single document type. And this was, going through all of these things, looking at things phrase by phrase, sometimes word for word, and then do these things actually exist within these areas? That's where the X's are. and then the levels, the green and yellow and red is like, is there high correspondence or is there low correspondence? And then from that, that'll help you come up with a reuse plan for moving legacy content over. And yes, you want to create a reuse strategy. So once the content's over, think about things like naming conventions for file names, IDs, so on and so forth. Determining how granular topic reuse will be, so it will be the topic, element, or phrase, or all three. And what criteria to use when content should be forked. In other words, when you should start afresh, start anew with a new set of content, and then add this material to your DITA style guide. Yes, have a DITA style guide. Well worth doing. And then you want to be able to communicate about this. So you want to create metadata to describe your content to make it findable. You want to determine where and what reusable content will be stored, and then coordinate how and when this content can be reused within the team. So you want to prevent people from looking through various haystacks for the proverbial needle. So to communicate this material. Make sure that everyone agrees upon what effective metadata is for describing the content, so that can then be found. And if you have something like a content management system, it makes that job all that much easier. And keep in mind, don't go overboard. Evaluate reuse efforts against the returns. In some cases, let's face it, it's just easier to simply write click OK rather than ConReffing it. In other words, finding the library topic that has click OK for, let's face it, probably 75-80% of all task topics in software, where you end up clicking OK. It's like, no, it might just make sense to just have a click OK and just write it. And another classic quote from my colleague Lee White, where she says, apples to apples and dogs to ducks. So when things are very different, don't try to squeeze reuse out of them. So if you have two very different document types, looking for reuse may not be the best use of your time in that particular case. Look for the commonalities, look for the apples, so to speak, and work with that stuff before moving on to the dogs and ducks. And also, knock down those silos. Effective reuse means that content can really no longer be siloed. And by necessity, content ownership needs to be shared and communicated. So, while one person or group should not own their content, keep in mind that you also have to manage change to content that is already shared. So you do need to coordinate that. But you no longer, people should no longer have the luxury of saying, well, this is my stuff and you can't touch it. Because effective reuse just goes out the window in that case, and also you lose things like consistency. You also, when writing content for reuse, keep things concise, because content reuse and minimalism really do go hand in hand. You also should get used to the idea of omitting terms like see the following or the above image, because that thing that's following may in fact be before it, and the above image may in fact be below it in a separate topic or not there at all. So when you're thinking about reuse possibilities as you write, make sure that drop any pretense of narrative in terms of A follows B follows C follows D, so on and so forth. You want to make sure that because people will be coming to individual topics when they come across them. They won't be reading, generally speaking, your manual from beginning to end. They'll be going into the middle, they'll be going into the first part, and it's not like a story necessarily. They're going into individual pieces trying to find information they need at a particular given point in time. So write content that is modular. And when it comes to finding content reuse, devise effective metadata and then tag your topics accordingly. Also, this is where descriptive titles comes in really handy. So don't just say, and I have seen this, where you have people say, here is introduction. Here's my topic, and it's called introduction. Well, introduction to what? Introduction to the product and what tell me more. And this is also where using short descriptions is really handy. I really am a strong advocate on having effective descriptive short descriptions, because they can be they're a way of not only telling the reader whether or not the topic they've landed on is a good place for them to find the information they're looking for. It can also aid writers in terms of devising the content to go into the topic, and also essentially to make sure that the content they're putting into this is in fact what ought to go there. And then that's pretty much it. For further reading, there's all of these articles I would highly recommend checking out. And at this point, I will then open the floor to questions.
Awesome. That was great, Keith.
Thank you.
All right. It's time for you guys to type in your questions. And while you do that, let me tell you what's coming up. Type them in. Here we go. And the next TC Dojo Mastermind session is coming up on February 16th. The Mastermind is a member-driven discussion group where everybody gets to talk and everybody gets to wrap their arms around topics they've seen, heard, read about, seen in a video, and just need someone to talk it over with. This is a confidential, supportive environment, and mastermind groups like this have been cited in Forbes magazine as having been extremely valuable to the attendees. We've got a couple of going on right now. In our next one, we're going to talk about stories of experimentation again with some of the things Keith was just talking about. They're all going to get together and talk about what each one of them did. It's really fun. In the next TC Dojo, we've got former STC president Kit Brown-Hoekstra coming. She's going to build on this notion of reuse, but from a different language angle. In fact, Keith was just talking about paying attention to the language you write. Kit's going to build on that notion and give you strategies for implementing controlled language. She'll talk about potential challenges and give you recommendations for working around them. Where do you sign up? Go to tcdojo.org. At the bottom of the page, you'll see Keith's video in a couple of days. If you want to rewatch it, and you'll see all the sessions that are coming up. There's some really good ones. All right. Let's see if we've got questions. Yes. You mentioned that you need to manage the library topics. Can you talk a little bit more about that? What type of management?
Oh, okay. Well, okay. Now, what I've most typically seen are library topics or referable content topics, however you want to name them. They're most typically thrown in at as individual topics which are designed so that they are not printed as in and of themselves. So in other words, you'll never just see a bunch of phrases, a bunch of key terms or product as printed in and of themselves. And then it's that content is then specifically for ConReffing to and or from. Now, but the larger question is interesting. So I've just talked about the mechanics. The question is, how do you then do this in a way that makes sense? Because you could have this all in one really large library topic. But what I'd recommend is, where it makes sense to have good divisions, that's where you should do it. So in other words, you might want to have material that relates specifically to, say the individual products. So, things like, say, like talking about product names, phrases that may be specific to the particular product that's being referenced. Or you may also want to, and then as a second division, you may also want to have a separate thing that talks about, for example, typical phrases used in tasks or concepts or references. So that's one other possible division. Those are the things that come off the top of my head. There's one really nice example. If you're wondering about how this is all done and you're not familiar with it, I would highly recommend there's something. It's called the Thunderbird Manual Set. It's on GitHub, and if you look up, it's actually been put together by Gnostics, and the fellow who runs Gnostics is Joe
Gollner.
Joe Gollner, thank you. Joe Gollner and Elliot Kimber have helped put together this, it's fictional Thunderbird documentation. They use these library topics, and it's done really nicely, really well. It uses keys and key defs. It's probably the best single example I've seen that's widely available for looking at this. So if you Google GitHub Thunderbird DITA, you should be able to find that, and it's free code. You can use it, throw it into your editor and or CMS, and there's some nice sort of practical ideas on how that's arranged there. And in that example, I know they also throw things into tables. So it's not just random phrases, but here is a column that says here's the brand name for the product, here is our other things relating to, say, the product within a column, and then the actual phrase for reuse is then in the next hand column. So it's some really that's one way how that's done. Well, we're checking out. That's probably overkill for what you're asking, but it was a good question.
It was. I'm going to see if they have another question, but I'm going to see if the answer to that was included in your previous answer, but I think it's also related to the next question. We have several library topics of definitions within a CMS intended to increase reuse. It's worked because now these topics are so large they take a long time to open. At what size do you cut off a library topic? Even by topic, a library topic could have thousands of reused elements in it.
Oh boy, yeah. Well, I mean, I think the dead giveaway there is that if it's taking a long time just for the library topic to open, it's probably time to to think about slimming that thing down. In terms of the criteria. It's tricky. It depends very much on the individual implementation. But again, sort of think about things like things like product, or even whether how these particular phrases are likely to be used. Are they going to be used primarily in concepts and tasks and references? That might be another way to subdivide that type of content. After that, it begins to get a little bit too individual for me. I'd have to have a look at some of the content, but generally speaking, if library topics, if you feel they're getting too big, you're probably right, and then it just comes down to, well, how can we then more effectively manage these things? Why don't we, instead of having things all in one big library topic, let's come up with a bunch of more rationalized subtopics. And you may find, in fact, what comes to mind is that if you do an audit of this, certainly with our own CMS, you can actually determine quite readily, what actual pieces of conreffable content are being used elsewhere. And you may find that if you have this type of facility on hand, you can see which particular document or documents are using ConRefs the most, and then have those into a separate library topic, and then then examine where whether or not the ones that are not being used in this particular publication, are they really being used as much as you think they are, and then maybe consider stripping those out. So that's a couple of different angles to that particular question. I hope that comes close to answering it.
Okay, well, we'll let them post a little note and see if that's true. Okay, our last question. Can you describe a little more about the content audit you mentioned that precedes legacy migration?
Oh, yes. In fact, if I may, I'm going to head back to yeah, I'd like to switch back to that, because that is a very real example from a much larger, whoops, I think I just went past it. There we are.
You need to share your screen again.
Oh, you're not seeing my screen?
I took it away.
There we go.
There it is.
There we go. You took it away? So this is from, because, I am by training an inclination information architect, and when working, this is from a spreadsheet I did with a particular client, and things have been made somewhat generic. But what I did in this particular case is that I was looking at a client, I was looking at their legacy documentation. In this particular case, I asked for the 5 most recent versions of a particular type of document, and it was a semiconductor firm. It was one of their I'm trying to remember remember now. I can't remember the type of document. But what I found is that, I went through the 5 most recent versions of this particular type of document. And then I methodically listed, I went through the table of contents. And what you see on the left-hand side is essentially the table of contents between these 5 different sets of docs. And you can see that for the title, the introduction intro statement, and about the processor, essentially those sections were all shared between the 5 publications. And then there was one which had an additional, product variants. And then it came down to the fact is, when I was looking at analyzing this for content reuse, it made a lot of sense to have all of the first 4 items. They were all pretty much common. They were close to, I think it was like 85 to 100% the same, other than, say, the product name, and those I identified in green. The one that was different because it was specific to that particular product, I didn't actually give that a color, as you can see there. Because it was just a one-time only thing. But if you look at the next one where it says features, well, the features were actually were different from a structural level. So I'm not just talking about they had different features for the products, but the individual sections were written differently. They had it was all very different. It was below 50%. So that's why that one was marked in red. And you can see then we have system diagram, software support, driver architect. They were then specific to document number 2 and not the other ones. So then I would go back to the people, to the writers of these documents, and I would ask them, does it make sense to have these features in all documents, or is this really just specific to this one document? And from all of this, I did. And you're just seeing one portion. This is just the introduction portion for what was typically I think it was like a roughly 200-page when outputted document type. So it was a fairly exhaustive review, but in the end it paid huge dividends because they came up with one document type that covered off, the vast majority of all of the of this type, all the things that this type of document would ever need, and also came up with a good plan for reusing content as much as possible. And I hope that answers the question. This is one of the really nitty-gritty things that good IAs really should do when they're doing legacy content transfers, is doing full-up audits of content. And this is one of the ways you can do that.
The answer is great. Thanks. Yeah, and I agree with you
Excellent.
there. All right, I had a couple of questions, but I can save those for another time because we're running short, and we've kept everybody, and we appreciate you all still being here. Let me just say one quick thing before we go. Be sure to sign up for the TC Dojo mailing list so that you can get the link to this session once the video is posted, and as well as announcements for future sessions. And don't forget the link to the survey so you can vote on what you want to learn. Every month we look at that list and go out and find experts like Keith here willing to share their expertise. Why should we tell you what to learn? You should tell us. The TC Dojo is our pleasure to host, and as always, if you need more information or personal help, you can contact us using your communication method of choice. Thanks, Keith.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
All right, guys. See you next month.